put and take and put, take and grow fishery. We started stocking rainbow trout in 1959. Brown trout started getting stocked in the mid 80s. Through the early 2000s, there was very little carryover of fish into subsequent years. When I talk about carryover fish or holdover fish, I'm talking about a fish that we stock in December, making an entire year. So I think those are the fish you guys are primarily interested in, the bigger fish. And the lack of carryover fish was really due to poor water quality that we had during the late summer and early fall. We had low dissolved oxygen. Sometimes we had high temperatures. And then we had rapidly fluctuating flows. And none of those things are good for trout or really any stream fish. So we started getting some improvements through the relicensing process, which TU and a lot of NGOs were very impactful with to help us get some better habitat in this tailwater. We got the site-specific minimum dissolved oxygen standard in 2004, which is supposed to be 4 milligrams per liter minimum and a daily average of 5. And that was achieved in 1999. They started by adding turbine vents, and then in 2005 hub baffles, and all these things were introduced to the turbines to help create more aeration and more oxygen in the discharge. Another big thing that happened during that relicensing process was a change from peaking to a reserve capacity operation. So that's what I'm showing here. And this top panel on the left is 2001, when they were still a peaking operation. And you can see this discharge going up and down, daily, sometimes intradaily, going from, this is in cubic meters per second, but it would go from about 100 CFS, which was just leakage through the dam, to a full capacity of 11,000 CFS. So that change to reserve capacity we see in 2015, where we have a lot more stable flows and a lot fewer of those high flow periods. So that was a big change to increase, to create better habitat in the tailwater. And then as part of that relicensing process, we ended up with some minimum flows. So these are minimum environmental flows that they have to keep in the river during certain periods of the year. Before it could go down to dam leakage. So these minimum flows really help with the quantity of habitat that's in the river. As far as our trout production, we've got one single cold water trout hatchery in South Carolina. You're seeing it there to the right. That's it. A lot of you guys have probably been to Walhalla, so you have an understanding of the size of this facility. But there's some, pickup trucks on the ground here to kind of orientate you to how big this facility is, which isn't very big. They raise all the trout stocks in South Carolina and all the fish that end up in the lower Saluda River. They raise rainbow trout, brown trout, and brook trout. And they work with 4 different strains of rainbow trout, work with Irwin, Arley, Tasmanian, and Fish Lake strains. And the importance of that is the eggs are they come in at different times from the federal hatcheries, or in the case of Tasmanians, we spawn them on site. So because we're limited by the amount of water we have to raise these fish, they have them spawning out at different times to meet stocking size and season targets. We've had a little bit of a change, which I'll go over later in the stocking philosophy, which actually happened a decade ago. But the target now is 10-inch fish. These are Tasmanian strain rainbow trout, and these fish, when they're stocked into the lower Saluda River, are over 2 years old. They're between 24 and 27 months old. So their whole life they've spent on this hatchery. It's a tremendous investment to raise these fish. And I'm just always impressed with the amount of fish and the great job that our hatchery staff do getting as much as they do out of this limited resource. Stocking prior to 2016, we did a lot of helicopter stocking. We used to have a helicopter, and then we gave it to SLED, and they did the stocking for us for a while. And then I think SLED more recently gave it to the Army National Guard. Apparently it's pretty expensive to maintain and keep a helicopter. So we haven't been doing that lately. We've been stocking by truck. That doesn't really bother me. I think we've got 4 different sites we typically use, and I think we can spread the fish out enough. We use the lower Saluda Shoal, the Saluda Shoals boat ramp up here is our top highest stocking site, and then the new lower Saluda Shoals boat ramp. This place here we call the Radio Towers, but it's right by Gardendale. And then down here at Quail Hollow by I-26. Those are the locations we've been using the last 3 years that I've been here. We're going to try to get in here and get some fish along the river walk. I think we've got an opportunity to do that. So we'll probably give that a try this year. The brown trout, we try to get them all out in one stocking event in December. The rainbow trout, we spread them out from December to March if we can. It's probably 10 loads of trucks that come down with rainbow trout, and the brown trout we can do in just a couple of trucks because they're smaller. This is the stocking history for the last 20 years. And our goal has been since about 2009 to stock 15,000 10-inch rainbow trout and 13,000 6-inch brown trout. You can see in the earlier years, the numbers of rainbow trout were often a little bit higher, and the size of the brown trout was a little bit larger. So I'll explain these panels here. On the left, you have rainbow trout. On the right, you have brown trout. The different colors are for the size classification. So red is advanced fingerlings, which are 6 to 8 inches. The orange is catchable fish, which are fish over 8 inches. And then fingerlings are in green, and those are fish less than 6 inches. So, and then we have each year along the bottom and the number stocked on the vertical axis. So early on, we were using a smaller fish. It was an Irwin strain fish. They were 8 to 9 inches in length, but we also were stocking some larger brown trout, including some catchables at that time. We essentially have like a weight allotment of fish for the lower Saluda River, and we can divvy these up how we want, by rainbow trout, by brown trout, a lot of small fish or fewer large fish. Back in the around 2009, the decision was made by Region 3 staff to go to a larger rainbow trout, which meant we stocked fewer of those. And that was a Tasmanian 10-inch fish. And then we stocked our brown trout at a little bit smaller size. And the hatchery's been pretty consistent, especially with the brown trout meeting that stocking demand. And I think they've done a good job with the rainbow trout as well. 2018 and 19, we started some fingerling stocking evaluations. So that's the green bars here. We were able to stock a bunch of those fish. And these fish, we have a tremendous investment in, the 10-inch rainbow trout over 2 years, and then the brown trout that go in at 6 inches are a year on the hatchery. These fingerlings are actually excess production. They make so many fish to meet their grow out demands. And then if they have extras, they have to get rid of them because there's no space for them at the hatchery. Usually they're traded off to other states, but I said I wanted them. So these didn't cost us anything to evaluate. Our trout population monitoring is done with boat electrofishing. We've been using the same standardized method since 2012. We have 8 sites we hit. They start, site 1's up here above Treehouse Shoals, and then they venture down. Site 8 is just below River's Edge above Stacy's Ledge. Site 9 we don't actually sample. It was part of a broader fish community study where we also collected trout, but for our standardization at sites 1 through 8. And our sites, we spend 20 minutes of effort at each one of these sites collecting fish. And this is, we're sampling trout habitat. This is trout specific. We're not netting other fish unless it's like an American eel or a conservation species. We're completely focused on trout and the shoals and the riffles, the runs and glides, and it's pretty difficult, tough on our equipment. And we do this monthly from December through April, and then bi-monthly June through October. I can't imagine that there's another piece of water in this state that is intensively sampled as the lower Saluda River. Once we collect the fish, we inspect them for tags or fin clips, because that's how we mark them for various stockings, or how we evaluate growth of individual fish once they're stocked. And we measure, weigh them, and all the fish are released alive. Our objectives for this monitoring are relative abundance. So this gives us an idea of how many trout are out there on a monthly or annual basis for comparison. We want to understand their growth and condition so we can assess the health of these fish. Condition is basically how plump a fish is. Does it weigh what it should based on its length? It's how we get an idea of how healthy the fish is, what the forage abundance is like, and what the habitat quality is like. Most years we look at the first year mortality of the fish that we stock, and then more recently we were assessing the relative survival of different size stockings. And of course, in 2018 we got the catch and release zone, and with that new regulation came an obligation to study and report back. So we'll use the same standardized sampling for evaluating the impact of the catch and release zone. And Ron, for those of you who have been members for a long time, Ron probably gave you, you've probably heard a lot of these numbers before. He had an intensive 3-year study that looked at not only the trout population, the entire fish community, as well as the angler. And this was accomplished with the standardized sampling that I just talked about. We had a tag return study on where a bunch of the fish that were put out were tagged so anglers could return them. And we had a creel survey going on at the same time. So some of the bullets from that study is 59% of the anglers out there were targeting trout, 32% were targeting striped bass. Of course, it's pretty seasonal with most of the trout effort in December through April, and then most of the striper effort, April through September. Most of the catch rates were fine for a tailwater, about half a trout an hour or 2 trout caught per trip. The majority of trout anglers practiced catch and release, and return to creel and exploitation rates were really low. Return to creel, this is essentially the proportion of fish that we stock that anglers catch. And exploitation is the proportion of fish that we stock that anglers harvest. So these were the 3 years where those numbers were calculated as part of the tagging study. And for rainbow trout, on average, about 13 out of every 100 of those 10-inch fish that we stock are actually caught by anglers. And then only 6 out of every 100 are harvested. For brown trout, those rates are lower, quite a bit lower. For every 100 brown trout we stock, 4 of them are caught by anglers, and about 1 of those fish is harvested. So these are, a lot of investment for poor return to creel and poor or low exploitation rates, depending on how you look at things. But this is really common for a tailwater fishery. It's a big expansive space. We put the fish out there. You do this in a small stream, and you get return to creel rates more in the 85, 90% or even higher. So as far as the population, annual mortality of stock catchable trout, rainbow and brown, was high, or in this case, the browns are really more like fingerlings. Each year, the stocked fish annual mortality was over 89% for rainbow trout, over 92% for brown trout. On the good side, growth is excellent. These fish grow really well, over 1/2 inch a month, and each year of this study from 2012 to 2015, and conditions good. So those fish that survive do really well. It's just getting them to survive that's the issue. So this is the relative abundance of first-year trout. So these are the trout the first year. So for the December stock brown trout, this would be December from one year to December of the next, or November of the next. And for the rainbow trout, this is December of one year until November of the next. But these are our measure of abundance. We call this catch per unit effort, and this is the number of trout we catch per hour of electrofishing on average for each one of these years. So our rainbow trout catch rates average about 10 fish per hour. They're shown in red. They average about 10 fish per hour. They're pretty variable. Yeah, we had some really big years where trout abundance was really high, like 2015 and 2018. And then we had some lower years like 2017, where we're only catching 7 trout per hour. Brown trout catch rates are very highly variable. They average about 6 fish per hour, and they range from 1 to about 10 fish per hour. So 2016 was a really bad year for brown trout, as well as 2019 and 2020. So highly variable catch rates for first year brown trout. And flows really make a difference on the catch and presumably the abundance of brown trout. So what you're looking at here on this axis is our catch rates that I just showed you in that bar graph. But now along the bottom axis, we have the maximum flow during the stocking month. So typically that's December for brown trout. There are a couple Januaries in here. And these fish are all stocked pretty much within 2 days of each other, at least during the same week. So I just used maximum flow. And you know, each one of these dots is a paired observation between the maximum flow for that stocking month and then the catch rate for those fish that year. And it's a pretty striking relationship. You know, the higher the flows are, the fewer number of fish that are going to be out there in any given year. And unfortunately, for the last 5 years, these are our catch rates. They're, you know, 4 fish per hour all the way down 2016 to less than 2 fish per hour. So 4 of our last 5 years for brown trout, we've had these really low catch rates that indicate low abundance of these fish. And it's also coincided with these high flow years. Fortunately, we kind of had an outlier in this relationship this past year, where our catch rates of brown trout were a little over 6 fish per hour, which isn't too bad, you know, based on the data that we have from 2013 to 2021. But otherwise, we've had 4 out of the last 5 that were pretty poor, and that's largely due to water. The higher the flow, the lower the catch rates for brown trout. And we see the same thing for rainbow trout. So now you've got first year catch rates of rainbow trout here on the vertical axis. Now on the bottom axis, we have the average flow from December through March of each year. Because remember, rainbow trout are stocked December to March of each year. So I use the average flow during that period. And again, you get this incredibly striking relationship. Except for these 2 outlier years. This was 2017 when we had those huge catch rates, which was a low flow year, and we would expect good catch rates. They were just really good that year. But again, you know, 3 of the last 5 years, we've had these high flows that resulted in poor catch rates of catchable rainbow trout. And then in 2017, for some reason, we had really low flows, but that was an outlier year where we had low flows and low catch rates. So again, higher flows reduce rainbow trout catch rates just like they did with brown trout. But 2021 was the average flows from March through December were kind of moderate, and we got kind of moderate catch rates. So that's the good thing, that last year we've gotten kind of moderate catch rates of rainbow trout and pretty decent catch rates of brown trout. So how do these high flows and impact the holdover fishery? Well, you know, if the first year fish aren't doing well, there's fewer fish to recruit to that holdover status. And we've seen a steady and significant decline in holdover rainbow trout and brown trout since 2017. So, I mean, it's just stair-stepping down, unfortunately, from this high in 2017 for rainbow trout, where we were catching 3 holdover fish per hour to now half a holdover fish per hour. 2017 brown trout were okay, about a little less than 2 fish per hour, to this past year, no fish per hour. And this is all likely associated with the high flows we've had during each fall and winter. Hasn't allowed the good numbers of fish to recruit to the holdover fishery. We haven't completed this year's sample yet, but obviously it wasn't good. We've only collected 6 holdover rainbow trout during our sampling this year, and no holdover browns. And this is growth. I showed you it from Ron's previous study from 2013 to 2015, but this is just carrying on brown trout in black and rainbow trout in red. And trout growth is excellent, conditions excellent. So again, you know, we've seen this consistently. Those fish that survive can do really well. It's just getting them to survive. So our fish, our brown trout that we stock in December at about 6 inches by June, they're 10. And your 10-inch rainbows are about 12 inches by June. So they do well. So I guess, you know, to kind of summarize those data that I just showed you, the Saluda River, it's a typical tailwater with tailwater problems. We get good growth. We can grow trophy fish. Catch rates are pretty comparable to other tailwaters. But the other things it has, like other tailwaters has, is very high mortality rates of stock catchable fish. It's got very low return to creel and harvest rates. And these are largely water dependent, water driven, flow driven. That's what it looks like is really impacting this fishery at this point. You know, their survival is impacted by hydro operations, weather and climate. And we've been in this wet period. Earlier in the study, in the 2013 timeframe, we were getting those higher fish. We were a bit drier, and things have gotten wet. So, you know, not many of the fish are being returned to anglers, and most of them are dying. So what's happening to them? They're just poorly adapted for life in the wild. A rainbow trout that's been in a hatchery for 2 years, brown trout that's been in a hatchery for a year. They're stocked out there. They're prone to immigration, especially if it's a high flow event. They might just move on down the river to the Congaree. They're excessively active. So their activity is much higher than a resident fish. They're moving around a lot. They're trying to find food or shelter, and it's energetically inefficient, makes them a lot more vulnerable to predation. So they have a difficult time finding shelter, and some fish have a hard time figuring out how to feed in the wild. They've been eating a pellet for 2 years. So it's tough to figure out how to make a living when they're out there in the wild. And then sometimes the forage will change seasonally, and they have a hard time having flexibility to adapt to a new forage base. And all of these things make them more vulnerable to predation. And there's a lot of predators. So in a smaller stream where we get those really high return to creel rates, predator load is is primarily anglers. It's a lot less. Here you got mammals, you got fish, you got birds, of course, you've got trout that'll eat these fish. So what I'm hoping is we can work on getting a fitter fish in this river. We started in 2018 evaluating fingerling stockings. We had an experiment in 2018 and 2019. The 2019 experiment did not work out well. We had some hauling and stocking associated mortality. So we got good growth information out of that, but not good abundance information. So these stockings were our Lee strain rainbow trout. These fish were about 3.4 inches long at the time of stocking. And they were stocked in June. We put about 26,000 out each of the 2 years. We had a really excellent intern during 2018 that developed a really nice post-stocking mortality study. And what this is trying to get at what is the mortality of these fingerling fish. We don't typically do this, move fingerling fish around in the summertime and stock them out. So what is the mortality that's associated with hauling and stocking these fish? So we had a nice little study where we had 4 sites. Each of those 4 sites, we had 3 different treatments. Each of these cages represents a treatment where we hauled the fish down. Some of them we didn't acclimate at all. We took them off the truck, we ran them out there, put them in the cage. Some of them we acclimated them from temperature midpoint from the river temperature to the temperature of the hauling truck. And in the 3rd treatment, we acclimated them all the way. And so this is to get an idea of what the mortality is associated with hauling these fish down here from Walhalla and stocking them out in the river. And there was none. So we were very happy with that. In 2019, unfortunately, we had issues with one of the trucks, or the aerator or something was the fish were getting caught in it. We had mortality, but we think we've fixed that issue. But those 2018 fingerling fish represented 33% of all rainbow trout we caught during the fall of 18. Remember that, the 2017, we had a lot of fish out there. So this isn't an inconsequential contribution to the rainbow trout population, these fingerling fish, especially considering we have very little investment in them. They grew really well, 0.8 inches per month. By December, they were the same size as the Tasmanians that we stock. And after a year, so in the following June, they were 14 to 15 inches in length. And yes, that was for both 2018 and 2019. We were able to follow these fingerling fish for an entire year, both experiments. And so they were a pretty good looking fish at that point. In fact, in that December, they were a pretty good looking fish. So in just 13 months time, with only 7 months in the hatchery, we were able to grow a fish that takes over 2 years at the hatchery to get to that 10-inch mark for our December stocking. So we're going to continue to evaluate these fingerling stockings. In fact, this December, we're going to work with Irwin strain rainbow trout. These fish are stocked in December, which is a little bit of a tough time to stock these little guys. They're going to be really small. They're probably going to be about 1.75 inches when they go out. But again, the Irwin hatchery in Tennessee was able to give us extra eggs. Our staff is going to hatch those out, and since they're not going to be raising them to large sizes, they don't take up much room at the hatchery at all. So they can hold on to them for the couple months it's going to take before we stock them in December. So our challenges, one's finding the right combination of stocking time and sizes to support both the put and take and put, grow, and take fishery. So we're always going to stock the catchable fish for our put and take anglers, but I want to work more on these fingerling fish because I think that's what's going to contribute to the holdover population eventually. It's just pretty tough to find a good time to stock these fish, and that's what the image is up here. We got the months along the bottom here. We got striped bass in the river from April through September. And not that striped bass are any more of a predator on them than other fishes and mammals and birds in the river, but it's a large predator load that time of year with the amount of striped bass that are in the river. And then after that, we get into the fall, and sometimes I got this poison sign here because sometimes we have poor water quality. Move into December, we're lowering Lake Murray lake elevation, so we got high flows. None of these things are really conducive to stocking fish, but we're going to try to match, a spawning month egg time essentially to get a fish that's the right size and stock it at the right time. And it's going to take some trial and error. The other time is just stocking our catchable fish at appropriate times based on current conditions. That's this figure here. 2019, we got CFS of the river here on the vertical axis, and then on the bottom axis, we've got December through April. We like to start stocking our catchable rainbow trout in December. But stocking them in these 10,000 CFS flows is just not going to do well. They're going to have real hard time figuring out how to deal with that. And many of them will probably just get washed down the river. And then on top of that, anglers can't access the fish when it's 10,000 CFS. So that's kind of what we're faced with the last few years. So in 2019, we're going to trying to hold the fish, but it wasn't until February that we got conditions that I wanted, that I thought would increase trout survival and also allow anglers the opportunity to catch these fish. But then the hatchery can't hold them that long. They got to get out. If I try to hold all the fish until February, they're going to tell me, if you don't move these fish, then you're going to look at smaller fish being stocked in subsequent 2 years. And that's what we're up against, because that's the amount of water we have to raise fish. And this has been an issue the last 3 years. Essentially, it's been tough to find a good time to stock them. Meeting supply demands, obviously I've kind of harped on that, what our facilities and abilities are as far as raising trout. I'm actually okay with what we have for the Saluda River, but there's increased trout demand all over the place. Well, not all over the place, but the northwest part of the state. So, meeting that supply demand is difficult. It would take millions of dollars to expand our hatchery production, to add another hatchery. Hatchery biosecurity is an emerging issue. I don't know if it's emerging, it's been around for a while, but it's a lot more in our face right now. We've got whirling disease in North Carolina and Georgia. Georgia just showed up with whirling disease, and I think at the time they were thinking a novel virus back at the end of August. Shut them down. Euthanized 800,000 fish, an entire year of production. And if that happens here, we've got one hatchery, you're not getting any trout that year, and you're not going to see any catchables for 2 years. So it's a big concern for us, trying to keep our hatchery clean and keep those fish healthy. Increased access, that's a double-edged sword. Of course, we want to expand fishing opportunities. That's kind of our job. For the lower Saluda River, the new walkway down the Saluda River walkway, that's going to be increased pressure, increased demand on this limited resource. So we're certainly happy to have those people out there, but it's something we got to consider with the fishery. That's increased pressure on it. And not only the walkway, but the lower Saluda, the Saluda Shoals lower boat ramp, to me was a huge deal. Prior to that, you could reach the mid part of the river, in a kayak and a canoe and a drift boat, or if you were a very competent outboard motor driver. But that lower Saluda ramp, that really opened up that section of the river to just about anybody. So again, more pressure. So these are challenges for us to keep this and keeping this fishery going. And then of course there's environmental stuff, hydro operations, climate, tropical systems, weather. Last year was obviously terrible. Hurricane Sally, it came up. It actually didn't come up, but the projection was that it was going to hit us. They had to move water out of Lake Murray. The last 2 years of water quality in Lake Murray has been absolutely horrible. There's been almost no oxygen after mid-June in the hypolimnion of that reservoir, which is where the water for this river comes from. So when they started releasing that water, it was void of oxygen. And yes, they have one of their turbines was not aerating properly. It wasn't venting properly, but it wouldn't have mattered with the volume of water that they were moving. So 3 days, no oxygen, obviously is going to put a hurting on the fishery. And then non-point sedimentation, pollution. I fish the lower Saluda River probably 30 days a year. And every time I drive by 12 Mile Creek, it drives me nuts. Just another kind of insult to the system. So that's the whole of my presentation. That's my email. If anybody wants to email me with questions, and of course I'll take some questions now as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason, for that great presentation. Very informative, for sure. Does anybody have any questions?
Jason, this is Mike Waddell.
Hey, Mike.
In 2020, there were 5 days of zero oxygen. And there were 27 days that the oxygen was below 4 milligrams per liter. And my question is how come nobody's enforcing these minimum oxygen levels?
Yeah, well, that would be a question for DHEC. I mean, we don't have any regulatory authority. They ask us our opinion, and we tell DHEC and we tell FERC our opinion, but that's pretty much all we have is our opinion.
Yeah, we asked them, Jason. They said sorry, essentially.
So, and what happened last year was terrible. But it's going to be difficult to overcome these types of things. We've got, during the relicensing process, there was lots of upgrades planned. They should have been completed by now, but their license hasn't been actually issued yet. And so they've been resistant to make the upgrades until their license is actually in place. And the holdup on their license is a federal thing. That's also out of our hands. They have agreed to start working on the modifications to the units to provide better oxygenation. The first unit is scheduled to be completed in 2023. So that's the bright side.
Has there been any difficulty or change in cooperation between SCDNR and SCE&G when it transitioned over to Dominion? Like, have they been cooperative?
Yeah, I don't think there's been any issues there. Essentially, the environmental staff, at least who we deal with, is pretty much the same. The top person changed, but he was replaced by someone, who was the second in command the whole time that we've been dealing with them. So, yeah, I don't think there was really anything with, their current abilities. Now, whether those abilities should have been enhanced by now or not, it's a different question. But with their current abilities or the abilities they had last year, there wasn't anything they were going to be able to do differently to resolve that issue. The only thing that would have resolved that issue is if the reservoir elevation had been much lower before it happened.
Well, you know, they could have done oxygen injection like they do at the TVA dams.
But yeah, that's a different thing. I mean, that was part of the relicensing
Yeah,
process.
they
and
wouldn't have any part.
Right. Yeah, well, that is something they could have done, but you know, that didn't make it through relicensing.
Well, in 2020, there was 0 days of flows less than 800 CFS for February, March, and April. And January had only 4 days that it was at 800 or less.
And what year?
2020.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, it was incredibly wet. That was kind of, you know, we've had some really wet years. And are you getting at like having flows for, you know, recreational flows, angler flows?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I understand. And we talked to them about that. And they were, you know, last year, I think, amenable to trying to get more of those low flow days. But, you know, a lot of that's dependent on how much water is moving through the system. Yeah, unfortunately, go ahead.
Yeah, I think your comment was right that they need, in the advance of these storms coming in, they should start lowering reservoirs sooner than later, so that you're not having to push so much water at one time, like they're doing right now.
Yeah. So yeah, you know, during the relicensing process, a hydrology model was made that suggested that keeping the reservoir summer pool elevation up at 358 was good for trout and striped bass habitat to maintain those cold temperatures. So that's how they've been operating, keeping it up, you know, and then Labor Day, start gradually reducing it. But yeah, I think, you know, we need to revisit that model given our current, you know, weather pattern over the last several years of the high water, because there is very limited storage capacity. And, you know, if something comes up or is predicted to come up and they have to move a bunch of water, they're running into trouble.
Well, also too, over there at the Saluda River Walk, that landing that's over there by the 26 bridge, you know, that sort of pseudo landing, which is way up above River Edge subdivision.
Uh-huh.
They've turned that into a real nice landing now. They widened it, they've gravelled it.
On the park side, on the Columbia side?
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, they had to do that in order, they had to launch some barges, put a drill rig on to go out to drill. So they turned it into a real nice landing now.
Well, we should be able to get some fish in there.
And
Yeah,
they
that's
built a
good.
nice road.
Yeah, I hadn't seen that yet. I would have seen it this week because we were scheduled to sample this week. But obviously now with the flows, we will not be.
Right. Yeah, they've done quite a bit of work up there in order to start building the new malfunction junction.
I have a question, Jason, as far as stocking goes. So if I understand correctly, when you're stocking those smaller fingerlings, you're having a significantly lower mortality rate than when you're stocking the larger fish?
No, not necessarily. No, the mortality is not lower, but we're able to stock a lot more fish with less investment.
Okay.
So mortality rate of the fingerlings is still high. I didn't put that in there. I think it was around 90% of the first year mortality of those. But you would expect you stock a larger fish generally to reduce predation mortality. So you have to weigh the cost of each size fish versus what their survival is. So that'll be, part of our studies going forward, determining that relative survival and then forecasting that out economically to see which we get more bang for our buck. But regardless of how that turns out, the sooner we get a fish out of the hatchery and into the river, the better it's going to grow and the more feral characteristics it's going to have. And it's going, in my mind, be a better fish. It's going to have a better opportunity to move into, the next year class.
And it's less cost to you, right?
Yeah, they're less cost.
Yeah.
But we're not making any big changes. I haven't changed anything other than adding these fingerlings, which don't cost us anything. So we haven't changed our request for the 15,000 rainbows and the 13,000 browns that we've been doing for the last decade. That's all the same.
Now, have you looked at the Whitlock Viber boxes at all?
Yeah, we've we spent some time looking at that after I think Malcolm brought it back from a TU meeting in Arkansas or whatever, maybe Missouri. But, we've looked through the literature at the success of that. I've talked to Arkansas game and fish biologists about it. And right now, I think it would be an interesting project. But, we kind of want to evaluate this fingerling thing first before we introduce another source of fish.
Okay. Anybody else have any other questions?
Yeah, Jason, that was a great presentation. I had one more just from a DNR side. I know Region 3, I mean, you have just an enormous amount of water bodies that you take care of, from rivers to lakes. But you said the Saluda is one of the most intensively managed. Would you say it's one of the highest priorities for Region 3 because it's unique?
Well, managed, yeah, it's the most intensively sampled. There's absolutely anywhere in the state. I mean,
yeah,
and Murray and the Lower Saluda are obviously tremendous resources in our region. I don't want to say they're the most important or anything, because we have the Ace Basin and Lower Savannah as well, and those are very important to us too.
Yeah,
it's just been a lot of work on the Lower Saluda over the last decade, and a lot of help from TU with that work too during Ron's study.
that's great. Thank you. And again, awesome presentation.
Well, thank you. I hope it was informative.
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. As always, if there's anything you need help with from TU, please reach out to us. We're always happy to send volunteers your way, or anything of that sort.
Oh, we appreciate that.
And thank you for your help with Trout in the Classroom as well.
Sure. Yeah, I hope you guys
Jason.
have a good talk.